Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Pierre Dennery, and I'm the country head for France at Aurora. In this episode, we're diving into one of the most pressing and often overlooked enablers of the energy transition, the power grid. Just a few weeks ago, Iberia experienced a widespread blackout, not due to a lack of generation or excessive demand, but because of something far more fundamental, a power grid that's no longer fit for purpose. As we race to electrify everything from transport to industry, grids are emerging as the central bottleneck of the transition, caught between expanding renewable generation and rising electricity consumption. So, in this episode, we're asking, what are the infrastructure and equipment needs behind renewables and electrification? What technologies, skills, and supply chains do we need to scale? And how are companies like Nexans reinventing themselves to meet the moment? To unpack all this, I'm joined by Elyette Roux. Elyette is the Executive Vice President for the Power Grid Market Division at Nexans, a company at the heart of the energy transition through its work on power grids and cable technology. The Power Grid Market Division covers all distribution grid-related business and makes up nearly 30% of Nexans' business. Elyette also holds the position of Managing Director of Nexans' Accessories Business Unit, and I believe she will tell us a bit more about it later. So, Elyette, welcome to Energy Unplugged. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Pierre. Looking forward to it.
So let's start with the big picture. In Europe and beyond, energy systems are under pressure. Record-breaking renewable installations, surging demand from data centers, electric vehicles, heat pumps, you name it, all putting strain on aging grids. So could you start first by maybe introducing Nexans and its place in this fast-changing energy landscape? What does Nexans do, and why is it a critical player in enabling the energy transition?
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. Indeed, at Nexans, we spark electrification thanks to tech solutions. And behind that, it's more than our core technology, which is about cabling systems. It's about how we are powering the energy transition thanks to resilient, smart, and scalable network. That's what we deliver as an essential need to countries like Spain, that you mentioned earlier. And we do it across the whole value chain, from our suppliers of raw materials like aluminum and copper, suppliers of machines and equipment, suppliers of skills, as well as our partners and customers, and of course, the end customer and the end user and the installer. So we work to create value with and for the value chain. And I will a bit explain it later what are the challenges that we are facing on the overall value chain. Today, when we are recording the podcast, this is the half-year financial results for Nexans. So I'm happy to say that we are today a capitalized of more of 5 billion euro turnover company worldwide. We have actually achieved a record year thanks to two main sectors. One is power transmission, focusing on generation of electricity thanks to offshore wind farms. And the second business that is contributing the most to the growth and value is Power Grid, which is the market division that I represent. So to do that, we are counting on 26,000 people worldwide, operating in 41 countries. And indeed, a bit later, I will talk about the specificity of the accessories business unit that is actually selling solutions in more than 90 countries worldwide.
Let's talk about the major challenges facing electricity networks today. From your perspective, what are the big picture issues grid operators and policymakers are grappling with at the moment?
Today, the grids must cope with an unprecedented complexity. Why? Because at the same time, they have to modernize, especially for the grids in the mature economy. They have to extend, and this is valid both for mature economies and developing countries, because they need to connect renewables, whether they are wind offshore, wind onshore, solar onshore, and now even offshore. They have also to be able to face the rising need in terms of demand from electrification usage driven by electric vehicle, to data centers that we know are energy hungry, as well as adapting to multi-directional flows, because as you know, right now we are having some prosumer flows, producer, consumer flow, where we use battery systems. So all in all, high complexity grid, where we have seen, again, I will repeat the example of Spain, where we need to modernize the grid. And this is happening worldwide at the same time. It's not like, it's Europe or US or China, it's everyone has a need for this electrification. And at the same time, of course, we need to connect between countries, we need to connect across oceans, and we need to look at the grid like the worldwide grid, not the World Wide Web, but close to it, because clearly, if we want to access some grid energy in some part of the world, this has to happen. So we need much more coordinated approach. And one of the challenges, especially in Europe, is to urgently make this coordination between countries in terms of what do we want to do for our grid systems.
You mentioned power generation through renewables and behind the meter generation. I think one of the big topic we hear about, and we actually did a podcast on this a few weeks ago, is the growth of data centers. How is that also an issue for grid operators?
Today, the issue is that you have some of our grid operators that we have as customers that actually have to say no to connection of data centers because they don't have enough power already to be able to power the needs of citizens like you and me. So when you reach to this level of not being able to connect those kind of assets, it means that your grid is clearly unable to absorb anything else. So the data center in itself is just the, let's say, cherry on the cake of complexity that the grid needs to absorb. Remember that behind the grid, there are some very physical, tangible assets, the one that we, Nexans, we produce, which are cables and the connecting accessories of those cables. And the cables, basically, they are enabled in some countries. They have been energized for sometimes 100 years. So the average age of networks, grid networks in Europe is around, 40 to 50 year old. It's more or less the same in the US. So it's unprecedented in the way that this grid both has to modernize, to expand for allowing data centers to connect, but also it has to sustain the high need of power that goes through it, because of course, the more we multiply renewable sources, the more complexity it is to handle those fluctuation of energy on the network. So this is a headache, I think, for everyone. We start to call the grid the bottleneck. I would like to remind everyone that it is a greater good for nations. So we have a lot of commonalities with our customers and partners to tackle those challenges together. And I will also explain a bit later on that it's also linked to the people behind the network. So I leave it to the next question. Yeah.
Actually, yes. Let's go maybe a layer deeper in the key themes we've outlaid and look at the kind of equipment that needs to be deployed, the type of technologies that need to scale rapidly. Actually, that's what I'm really interested about here, because this is your specialty.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. So, for the ones that I've been a bit knowing about the energy or electricity connection, even if you are just a simple citizen, right? When you talk about electrical equipment, there has been a lot of information about transformers and substation. I mean, even if you are not an electrical engineer, you know that there is a transformer close to your neighborhood, a substation to which you connect to be able to have your energy in your house. So a lot of people have been focused on these relevant equipments that have been, by the way, the bottlenecks for now a long time for the grid. But however, at the same time, remember that in any networks, what are the critical point of the network is the interface or the connection between, in our case, two cables together, or one cable with a transformer, or one cable with what we call a medium voltage cubicle or medium voltage equipment. And this accessory is not accessory as in French. It's really like connected and made to the usage of the grid. And there are as many accessories as it takes, with the difference of cables, networks, and of course, equipments that they need to connect. So the last thing I would like to mention is that there is a study now existing for many years from the International Energy Agency that is stating that 80% of the grid failures happens at the point of connection, so at where you have your connecting accessory. And this is what causes blackouts most of the time. And the second information that IEA is giving us is that 60% of those failures are linked to a wrong human installation mistake, which means that everything that can be done to simplify, secure the installation of those accessories makes our grid more resilient from at least a physical perspective. Then there is the digital side of the grid, and this is also something that we are going to tackle in the next question.
Actually, if I can come back to this question and talk a bit about the Iberian blackout. So was this related to accessories, for example?
No, in that case, it was more linked to the way to manage the grid and the fluctuation that are caused by, what happened with the, let's say, unplugging of massive production of renewable. So, it's a question of the fact, it's a topic of the grids have been designed in their way to be performed to have stable energy sources. And the more we plug renewables, the more we plug new usages that, like I said, now can not only produce, but also consume, but also produce, the more fluctuations there is on this grid. And as a matter of fact, there is a need for IoT systems that are enabling that this grid performs well to do two things. One is to be able to react with real-time diagnostic, also, but also to predict in terms of predictive maintenance, but also predict to prevent issues to happen in the future.
Okay, so in this case, it's the lack of investment in IoT,
Yes.
for example.
Could be because we don't have the detail, but indeed, we know that all the grid operators worldwide need to invest massively into digitizing their asset, their grid, their what we call the mesh, the feeders, to be able to move from only corrective actions to more, preventive down to predictive action. And this is what costs a lot indeed, because you have to know your grid in terms of inventory of your assets, and you need to know what is the status of your assets in terms of healthiness. And this is something that is also has been under invested in the past, because like I said, everybody thought, oh, the grid is here, it's our greater good, it works, no need to invest more into it. Everything that is happening worldwide is pushing for a higher attention. And I will then mention one last thing, because you asked me about the role of accessories in the grid failure. It was not the case in the case of Spain. However, if I can quote one of our key DSO grid operator in Italy, during the heat wave that touched Europe beginning of July, the same customer mentioned several times that they have hundreds of failure of accessories joint on their grid. Hundreds every day. So what do you do when you have that because of the heat wave? And by the way, you not only have to replace the accessory, but you have also to replace the cable, because remember that everything is linked. So this is something that is quite unknown in Europe, because most of our grid networks are underground. Where it's very visible is as soon as it is overhead type of network, which is the case, for instance, in Americas or in Middle East, Africa. So I would say we need to make visible what is the invisible grid today in Europe, and we have also to make visible the investment and the capacity to execute them on this grid, including digitization. Yeah.
So I think we kind of covered technical complexity, although we could go into a lot more details.
Yes.
And I'm going to move on to my next point, which you hinted at. We also hear a lot about constraints to deploying grid technologies at the required pace. And people usually they think about capital, for example. But actually, what you're saying is money isn't the only bottleneck. What are the hard limits we're hitting in terms of capacity to deliver?
Yeah, so we have two main scarcities touching us in the power grid. The first one is linked to the raw material when it comes to metals, because in the end, cables are the ones that are basically driving the electrons from one source to another, directional or bidirectional. They need to be driving through either copper or aluminum. Okay, in the grid, mostly worldwide, it's primarily the use of aluminum that is the one in place. There is still the use of copper. And what we can see is that aluminum smelters are mostly into non-European countries. So when you are in Europe, for instance, you depend on buying your source of aluminum from elsewhere than Europe, unless you look into what we have developed now 2 years ago in Nexans, low carbon aluminum. What does it mean? It means that we are basically purchasing through long-term partnership aluminum from partners that are smelting aluminum through hydraulic or geothermal sources, which makes it greener. And we also do a lot of recycled aluminum, thanks to the capacity to collect the scrap of aluminum cable. And this you recall maybe, Pierre, from one of my last conference with you, that we can only make recycled aluminum cable from aluminum cable. And that makes it very specific and then very much focused in terms of where do we need to source the scrap. And you have this aluminum from dismantling the grid, knowing that usually the high voltage grid that is with transport operators, this grid, we are making partnerships to collect back the cable scrap. When it comes to the underground grid, usually those cables are left underneath the soil. So unless there is a contract for general contractors to pull them out. So we are kind of facing this scarcity in aluminum, even though people are thinking, no, there is no scarcity in aluminum. Yes, if you do look into more circular loops of collecting and creating a new source of aluminum, low carbon and recycled. There is another scarcity that is very important. It's the scarcity of skills. So most of our grid operators are telling us that worldwide, what they face as a bottleneck is the installation of the grid coming from the higher complexity of the grid, hence the higher qualified, skilled network installers. And what does it mean? I will give you an example. In the UK, till now, for the grid, it was 33 kV. So if you were a grid installer that was certified to install 33 kV network, then perfect. Now the grid is moving to 66 kV because there are much more renewable energy, offshore wind in the UK that is going through the grid network. So in fact, you need to be trained and qualified for getting this new license to operate. But if you don't have it, it means that you cannot actually work on the grid. So think about those grid operators that needs to install faster, more of this grid, which is cable systems and equipments, and you basically don't have access to the skills. And you cannot source them from other countries. It doesn't work. So the skill topic, scarcity of skills, is for now the major bottleneck in the speed to modernize and extend the grid worldwide.
From one of our previous discussion, I think you mentioned that it was a particularly strong issue in Europe compared to other geographies. Is that the case? Or you're actually saying that every country is facing it?
No, every country is facing it. And we know that in some countries, they have paid attention to it more in advance, let's say. I can again mention Italy, where the major DSO there is now even launching tendering on trainings. Just to tell you to which extent this service, because it's a service. Some of us, like Nexans, we are accredited, certified training for grid installers. It's really something that is critical for the future because we are all going to the same source of skills, which are typically electrical, mechanical skills, where you would also source, the people that we need in our plants, or the same people that you need in the technician or technical department at the DSO. So that's why we know now that the education system is not providing enough of those skills. So that's why we need to work to upskill the existing skill. We need to help converting skills to those new skills. And of course, we need to make sure that we are also helping the education system to change, which is what we do, for instance, in France, where we are the only industrial partner of, for instance, Enedis, in terms of what is called Grid Network School, to create from the start, from out of baccalaureate, a graduation program that is helping to get more of those skills being educated and trained to operate on the network later on.
Going back to your first point on the bottlenecks and the raw material, I think that brings me to a topic I wanted to touch on, which is sovereignty. Right now, we're seeing a large amount of public spending in network infrastructure, especially in the EU, but too often the money ends up supporting non-European suppliers. So what do you think it would take to ensure that European investment strengthens European industries?
Yeah, I have a simple answer to give here, but that would need to be, or is actually being evaluated, is that we in the energy sector, we are now facing the situation that the automotive sector faced like five years ago. And same for the telecom sector a few years ago. Okay. So Europe has been already there in other type of sectors. And it's important for us basically at Europe level that we make the learnings, because it's nothing different. Nothing different. No? So again, I would say we should learn from the past to drive a better future for our energy industry, so that we indeed keep much more sovereignty into the grid network. Some countries in the world outside Europe, they don't care, as far as I see. We should care, because we've seen in the different conflicts now in Europe that there is a key competitive advantage to have a sovereignty in the energy sector.
Maybe going to the last point I wanted to discuss with you before we wrap up. It's a bit of a buzzword, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on digitalization. You talked about it a bit earlier, but also AI. So as we face some hardware challenges that you've mentioned, there are also huge promises in the software space, and especially in AI. And so where do you see the most meaningful deployment of digital tools and AI in grid operations?
It's a good question, because actually we are already using AI for daily operations on the grid. It's already part of the daily operations, meaning it, as you said, it became a buzzword, but it has always, and for some time, been there. And AI is there from predictive maintenance to network forecasting, and it helps us to provide the right data at the right time to the right people on the grid operation to help them anticipate and prevent problems on the grid. And you heard me say before that we have this human challenge on the installation from the skills perspective, which means that you also heard me mention that we in Nexans, we are providing a training experience in our training centers worldwide. And what we've done with those training centers, where we host, thousands of electrician, grid installer every year, is that we have used the right and wrong installation that they've done to train and to qualify, to actually train the AI model. So basically, for instance, the simple application of what we do for grid installers right now, if you think about a simple underground connection junction between two cables, we have the pictures for 10 years, I would say 20 years, of right and wrong installation by grid installers. So we fed the model by it, and now we are able to say to the grid installers in his real life, okay, the cables are correctly prepared for installation. The joint is correctly mounted on the cables. The joint can now be closed, sealed. The joint can now be energized. And, all these steps basically are backed by AI, by our own expertise, working with all same generation of installers in the past. So this is very practical. And at the same time, we are working to provide a system performance warranty to say, okay, if you actually are leveraging on our cables, our accessories, and our services like trainings, we can actually stamp performance of the system up to 10 years. And we see a lot of customers right now, especially in the renewables or data centers, that are looking at this kind of key differentiator for themselves, because that in the end, all of us, what we need to do is to reduce the risk on the grid. And reducing the risk by providing, performance of warranty of the system is very important for those customers.
What strikes me from the discussion is how fast actually the challenges and the tools that you're using are evolving, especially for an industry that is often seen as quite or very conservative, actually. But
Yes.
let's maybe wrap up with a broader reflection. I like to ask, like, if you could change one thing, whether it's, policy, market structure, mindset, even, to help grids evolve faster, what would it be? And also on a personal note, what development or trend are you most excited about in your field over the next 5 years?
Okay, clearly, if I would change one thing right now, is to reach faster to the alignment between policy ambition, especially in Europe, energy planning, and industrial capabilities that we can provide. Today, we often move at different speeds. or with different ambition. And this is really holding us back. And I really hope that we can change that in the coming year or 2 years. In the sector, in the grid sector, we say that we have those 2 years now, starting from the Spain blackouts, actually, like a countdown of making the change to a line. To answer your question on what excites me the most for the next 5 years is, as I said, that we have a scarcity of skills. At the same time, we need to create those skills from a new generation joining the energy sector. And they really bring a different perspective into combining engineering with digital and purpose, because they really want, for most of them, to succeed into bringing the energy transition to the next level. Because they are not just building infrastructure, and we are not doing that in Nexans. We are shaping a sustainable backbone of energy for electrification of the future. So I'm really looking forward to the next step, because these are the people behind the grid that will make the grid more resilient, smarter, and safer, and secure for the next generation to come. Because no one wants to wake up one day and have no water, no elevator, no EV working, no data. This is the kind of nightmare that you don't want to go through. So this generation is there to enable this change.
All right. Well, a huge thank you, Elyette, for shedding light on a topic, the topic of grid, that often stays behind the scenes.
Thank you, Pierre, and very happy to continue discussing about this topic for the ones that are interested.
That was Pierre Dennery, country head for France at Aurora, talking to Elyette Roux, Executive Vice President for the Power Grid Market Division at Nexans. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow the podcast via whatever platform you use.